Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rica Estrada from the CCP Visual Arts. Thank you so much for coming on a Saturday to attend this very, I think, important and interesting forum today. Um, I won't be introducing all the speakers, although we will be having Dr. Jose and our curators of our Lying in State exhibit, Clara Ramirez Jr. and Eileen Regaspi Ramirez. So without further ado, I introduce Mr. Clara Ramirez Jr., one of the co-curators of the exhibition.
Magandang hapon. Mahirap magsalita pag 2:30 nakakaantok. So anyways, I'll try this. Just parang bambarag lang ha. Alam mo naman ako, pang commercial lang. How do you do this? Si Noy? Noy? How do you do this? Click. And then I'll just point to them. O yan, black. Anyways. Ganda yung istorya natin ngayon, heroes, right? I was also thinking about the term and wanted to see kung ano yung mga, kung sino yung audience. So anyways, I just clipped a couple of things. In 2002, lumabas yung konsepto ng mga heroes. And then, kahit sa pagkain, 2004. Hindi rin nawala yon. Sa Canada to ginawa, ni-launch to sa Canada. And they have heavy hitters. And then all of a sudden, the anime came in. And then in 2005, ginawa to ng, I think, ABS-CBN. But of course, we have the RPG Metanoia, which is 2005, which is very interesting because we invited the team 110 animation to be part of the exhibition. Actually, this was the first animation, full-length animation that won a couple of awards. Very interesting. Talks about different kinds of heroes, being self as heroes. So. And then, in 2010, 5 years in the making, yung idea nila. And then, of course, ayaw magpatalo ang Walt Disney. Gumawa sila ng big hero noong 2014, right? But again, we have this crossover. And in 1990, Mang Cesar was awarded National Hero and was exhumed in 2016. So we go to the questions of heroes, which was a take from a book that my co-curator will be speaking a little of as I introduce her and the speaker. Un momento. Eileen, of course, is the co-curator and assistant professor in the University of the Philippines and advisory board of the Asia Art Archive. One of the leading scholars on performance arts studies in the Philippines. Of course, the eldest granddaughter of Cesar Legaspi, co-curator, and the other half of me. The other speaker is Dr. Ricardo T. Jose, who is current director of UP Third World Studies Center. He is the prominent scholar in the Second World War in Philippines and the Asia Pacific, an expert in Japan-Philippine relations and the United States colonial rule of the Philippines. I'd like to introduce first the Eileen Legaspi, who will be moderating for the conversation.
Sorry. All right. I just wanted to. I'm not one of the speakers. I just wanted to kind of frame this event within the centennial events that we've lined up for this year to celebrate my grandfather's turning 100. Um, so this is a photo of an event that I actually missed. Um, my grandfather passed in 1994, and this was a picture of his lying in state as he was honored as National Artist for Visual Arts. That is one of the perks of being a national artist, to be accorded this honor, as well as, of course, having your body interred in Libingan ng mga Bayani. However, you might wonder, why are we having a talk on Philippine history in the midst of an event that is primarily anchored on visual art? This particular event, we wanted people to think about how icons travel over time, how they transition from different fields. If you are familiar with the Guy Fawkes mask, I would imagine my students would. You would know that the image comes from a rather obscure British history event that really doesn't have much to do with our own history, but has been adopted as an icon of the anti-globalization movement. So it appears very frequently. I don't know how to do that. Sorry. What are you doing? Okay. Frequently on the streets. The other thing I wanted to bring up was that I encountered an article very recently from the New Yorker, which talked about this particular question: why don't facts change our minds? And it was anchored on 1975 study in Stanford, wherein primarily college students were asked to undergo this psychological test, where they were asked to examine notes that notes that they had been told were suicide notes, and the respondents had to make out whether these were genuine notes or not. Those who were told that they had successfully made the distinction between the fake notes and the real ones eventually were told as well that actually all the notes were real. But the post-test of that experiment showed that they clung still to their belief that only the notes that they had examined were the real ones. And the Stanford test basically made a point about how people have a confirmation bias, where they only believe facts that already agree with what they already were thinking in the first place. No? So I was thinking maybe those are the two pegs that we could look at for this afternoon as we call on Dr. Jose. But before that, I'll just show you a few more, just like two more icons, I think. Of course, this is Che Guevara, a very well-traveled icon, which has ended in everywhere from T-shirts to keychains to ref magnets. No? Who continues to be revered in significant parts of Latin America, but will probably not really register in the minds of people who have no interest in history whatsoever. So, points of history that are actually contested, like Che's being whether he's actually an actual hero or a murderer or a killer. And I'd like to end with this particular shot, which, if you had made it to the opening of Lying in State, was of, that's Vim Nadera in the middle, against the backdrop of part of the CCP lobby. But to his right is an image of the great hero, which is an image that we were unable to borrow for Lying in State, but which, to my mind, doing the research for this exhibition was a clear indicator of what my grandfather was thinking of in terms of the Marcos regime towards the end of their term and towards pretty much the end of his life as well, because he passed in 94. So those are the pegs. We wanted to lay them out there before before you and before I call Dr. Rico Jose the real expert on World War II over. Thank you, Dr. Jose.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming here on a very hot Saturday afternoon. This is a historic day for many reasons. One is, of course, this time in 1898, you had the Americans here already. They had just won in the Battle of Manila Bay, and Aguinaldo was preparing to come back. And then you had other events in May several years later on. Today is also interesting because it's the 90th birthday of my father. He passed away 9 years ago, actually. So we were in this theater many times because he was a pianist. He performed here several times in the 70s and the 80s. But anyway, I was asked to give a little take, or my take on heroes and heroism and the Filipino concept of heroes and Filipino heroes through history. Of course, this idea I had been working on for a long time, and indeed the ideas, the concepts that Eileen mentioned, myths, how they change through years, I'd like to tackle that in a little way. Who we actually commemorate, who we consider heroes, why were they considered heroes, are they still heroes today, and so on and so forth. I prepared a short slide presentation, and you'll have to bear with me because I erased by mistake the original slide presentation, and I had to try to redo the whole thing very briefly this morning. But anyway, I tried to put my basic ideas in this. Part of it also is based on a previous presentation I made shortly after the screening of General Luna. Because when General Luna was shown, this brought in all these ideas of were our generals really like that? Was General Luna really like that? Was the revolution really like that? It brought out a lot of questions on who our heroes were. And so when that particular movie was a major hit, we had a special session in the Mind Museum in VGC to talk about heroes and heroism. So this is a much deeper take on what I presented then. So maybe can we start with the slides? It's the first one. So again, it's a take on a question of heroes, because a question of heroes is taken from the title of a book that Nick Joaquin, also a national artist, also whom we're celebrating his centennial this year, he wrote a series of articles in the defunct Philippines Free Press looking into the human side of our heroes from the revolutionary era. He looked at Rizal without the overcoat, so to speak. He looked at Bonifacio, he looked at Luna, he looked at all our revolutionary heroes from a second point of view, not so much as revered people, but as human beings with weaknesses and with strengths. So taking that as my cue, it's a question of heroes, but really these are some of my observations on Filipino heroism and how some of the heroes were made and how some were not, or how they were unmade. So let's start with the first look. Okay, in general, who is a hero? In the traditional sense, we would say the classic definition of a hero is someone who, in the face of danger or adversity, from a position of weakness, displays courage, bravery, and self-sacrifice. So these are the basic points. You are in a weaker position. You're faced with a situation where you are the underdog, so to speak, but you don't let that condition bear you down. You don't let it hold you down, and instead you use it as a challenge so that you can bring out the best in yourself and your other friends. So again, it's courage, bravery, and above all, self-sacrifice. These are important words because when we examine some of our heroes, we see that very clearly. And when we look at others who claim to be heroes, we see that some of these characteristics are missing. So beyond the call of duty, it is something that you are not expected to do. It's something that you do beyond what you are expected to do. For some, it is the greater good. It will benefit more people than just the individual. So in Filipino, we use the word ginhawa. This is one thing that heroes do. It is not for personal aggrandizement, not for personal interest, but for the same members of a platoon, for a company, for a town townspeople or for the country as a whole. And then we look at our own word for hero, bayani or bagani. What is the root of this? Bayan. It's not, again, oneself. It is, you're thinking of the bayan, you're thinking beyond yourself. And the root word hero itself comes from the Greek word which represents warrior or protecting. So that's why we have the element, at least in the English sense of it, wars, protection, fighting. That is the concept that we have in hero using the Western concept of this. In our concept, bayani, it is not quite the same. So bayani and hero are not exact translations of each other. All right, general types of heroes. Very quickly, we'd say the most classic type of hero, again, following from the Western definition of hero, is a hero in war and conflict. And generally, these are recognized by medals. There are heroes in peace, however, and these are in times of crisis, where people again respond to particular events and go beyond the call of duty, whether they are in the military or in civilian life. There are heroes in the armed forces. These are the most typical. When we look at our definition of heroes, we usually see them as soldiers, sailors, pilots. And again, this stems from the original definition of the Western concept of hero, that they are warriors. Again, in our terms, they would not necessarily be so. Civilians, you have that coming in later on, that war and peace were actually eras where heroism could shine in. And there are national heroes as well as local heroes. For the national heroes, of course, we recognize Rizal, Bonifacio, and the others. Are we aware of the local heroes who have not gotten into the national mainstream? Because if you go to any town, if you go to any province, they have their own group of heroes, and very few of them enter into our national textbooks. If you go to Cebu, it's not Aguinaldo who's important, but it's Leon Quilat, the local guerrilla leader there during the Phil-American War. If you go to the mountain provinces, Aguinaldo is irrelevant also, but they have their own local histories. In the Ilocos area, they have their own local heroes. I gave a lecture once in Tagbilaran in Bohol. I talked about their World War II heroes. This was to a group of teachers. And when I ended that, the teachers came to me and said, now we know why our streets are named that. Because they did not know who these people were. So they had the wartime governor and all the streets in the city of Tagbilaran are named after World War II heroes. And the teachers did not know anything about it. It had not entered even into their mainstream local histories. So we have the national heroes, we have the local history, local heroes. How do we memorialize heroes? How do we make them immortal? Of course, for the military side, these are medals. The medal that we have here is the Medal of Valor. It is the highest medal in the Philippine military system. It is the equivalent of the Medal of Honor in the United States. And the members of the Philippine military who have won this are very few, and they are generally a very select few. Unfortunately, there is one medal that is contested, and the basis for this I shall not discuss in this presentation, but if you want to discuss it later, we can do so. But the basis of this is very questionable. And just to add a little more to this, most medals of this type are awarded very soon after the event occurs. The United States has a system wherein the Medal of Honor, for example, which is their highest medal, cannot be awarded until it has a time limit. It should not be awarded beyond 5 years after the event took place. Beyond that, no more, because the first 5 years is when people are alive, can testify about what happened, and so on and so forth. Beyond that, it gets more vague. It gets less sure. So the Medal for Valor is, again, yes, supposed to be our highest medal, and automatically, winners of the Medal of Valor are supposed to be buried in the libingan ng mga bayani. But again, there are issues relating to that. Not all of the Medal for Valor awardees were buried in the Libingan. There are others who are buried outside, and they're quite proud of it. How else do we memorialize our heroes? We write books about them. We write the biographies. And how many biographies are there of Jose Rizal? There are many, many biographies. Bonifacio, the same thing. But what about the other heroes that we don't know that well? There are very much less on them. Also, other forms of media have been used to depict these heroes. How many movies have been made actually, again, on Jose Rizal or on Bonifacio? There are so many of them that were made. Alternative forms of media have also been used, docudramas, radio plays, and so forth. So they attempt to keep these heroes alive. Legislation, this is now another political form of keeping heroes alive. Legislation is used to name places after people who have passed away. Rizal Park, for example, Quezon City, although Quezon City was named Quezon City before Quezon was gone. He was still alive when that happened. But we have several other places named after Revolutionary or World War II heroes. Again, the generation today doesn't really know sometimes who their towns are named after. There is one that is northern Luzon. There's a place called what is this? Guillermo, or rather eastern central Luzon. There's a town called Guillermo Nakar. He was a guerrilla leader in World War II. He refused to surrender, was captured by the Japanese, and was executed. And the townspeople from his hometown were so proud of him that they named their town after him. So it was local act that named it after him. Holidays in northern Luzon, in Ilocos Norte, Roque Ablan, the governor of Ilocos Norte before and during the war as a guerrilla, his birthday is celebrated as a regional, provincial holiday. So these again are legal methods of trying to keep the memories of these men and women alive. Names of places, holidays, again, most of them are local. In the case of the national holidays, we have only one holiday, for example, for World War II, and that used to be known as Bataan Day. It is now Araw ng Kagitingan, or Day of Valor, which commemorates everybody in World War II. There are also monuments that are put up to enshrine these heroes. And finally, cemeteries also for them. Not only the libingan ng mga bayani, there are other cemeteries which are devoted to heroes of World War II or other heroes of Philippine history. The North Cemetery, for example, contains certain areas devoted only to heroes of the Revolution or other parts of Philippine history. So cemeteries are well worth your while to look into who are buried there. All right, these are some pictures showing what some of these commemorations are. The upper photograph is, of course, the entrance to Libingan ng mga Bayani. And within Libingan ng mga Bayani, there are smaller monuments for the defenders of Bataan and Corregidor, for the veterans of the Korean War, and so on and so forth. There's an area for former presidents, there's an area for national artists and national scientists, and there's a large section there of those who died in the prisoner of war camp in Camp O'Donnell in Capas, Tarlac. The lower photograph is an interesting one because this is not a government-sponsored memorial. It is the Bantayog ng mga Bayani. These are the victims of the martial law regime. And these are the lists of names of those who died, among many others, who were martyrs to freedom during the martial law regime. The photograph on the left is something some of us are probably familiar with. It is another way by which the government looks at alternative heroes, not the traditional heroes, but national artists. So we have the national artists and national scientists who are also regarded now as alternative heroes to the conventional military or war heroes that we had in the past. All right, so Philippine heroes in the past. Of course, these are almost hackneyed images, but if we look at all of them, there are many questions that we have about each and every one of them. Lapu-Lapu versus Magellan. Okay, some people in Mactan want to have the day of the Battle of Mactan declared as a holiday. Because they were saying that, why is it araw ng kagitingan when we were defeated in Bataan? Let's choose a holiday where we are victors. And the Battle of Mactan, we definitely won against Magellan. But look at how the battle is depicted, the upper photograph there. It has Lapu-Lapu with his own local sword fighting Magellan. That is not historically accurate. The two probably never met face-to-face in actual combat. They were too far away from each other. So this is again a very dramatized version of how the battle took place. Diego Silang and Gabriela Silang versus the Spaniards. This took place in 1762 to 1764. The British had come in, so the Silang couple had allied themselves or tried to work with the British to fight the Spaniards at that particular time. Diego Silang was, of course, assassinated, and Gabriela Silang continued the fight. But again, the dramatized versions of Gabriela Silang on a horse leading an assault on the Spanish positions is not quite the same thing. If you go to Makati, also you find her riding a horse. There's a sculpture of her there. And it's, again, a romanticized version of heroism. So heroism is not, I mean, that does fulfill a function. I mean, it encourages us, it inspires us, but actually war is never that romantic or never that picturesque. It's always ugly. Andres Bonifacio, don't need his picture here. Antonio Luna, Gregorio del Pilar, all very familiar to us also. Photographs show it, but like with Jose Rizal, note that these are post photographs. Now, what were they really like in real life? Now, if you're familiar with Jose Rizal, he always had his portrait taken from the front or from slightly front of one angle. Because if you took it from the side, you would find out that he had a longer chin than we actually thought he had. And he was very aware of that. So, okay, these are our standard rundown of revolutionary and Spanish period heroes. But in so doing, in focusing so much on the revolution, we tend to forget that there were other heroes in Philippine history. And so we move on to another one. Okay, it got stuck. Okay, yeah, here we go. Okay, so these are again other signs of that memorialization of these heroes. The one on the extreme left is, of course, the Rizal Monument, and that is also a very stylized monument showing Rizal standing tall and proud and all of this. Again, he didn't always look like that. That is, again, the sculptor's version of how he looked like. The photo to the right of that shows the Bonifacio Monument, which is now unfortunately very difficult to reach because of the transportation issues in that part of town. But again, it's a very dramatic picture showing Bonifacio, the flag flying behind him. Again, the symbol of Bonifacio was that he was a warrior, he was fighting, he was a man of action. We forget that he was an intellectual as well, and that he also wrote and he had deep-seated ideas. So I threw in another picture here of another memorial, another monument to Bonifacio, which is in front of the railroad station, Tutuban Railroad Station, because he lived there actually. And this shows him not as a fighter, but as a writer and as a thinker. And so this portrays the other side of Bonifacio. The bottom photograph, of course, is that of it's a poster of the General Luna movie. So we have all of these different portrayals of heroes from the revolution. But we tend to stick so much to the revolution. It's important because this was building the nation, fighting for independence, but there were heroes after that too. And so one person I'd like to bring your attention to is one Filipino who fought and died in World War I. And this happened 100 years ago. And no one in the Philippines seems to be doing very much about it. In Europe, in Britain, in France, and in Germany, World War I is the major thing they're talking about in terms of history, because it happened 100 years ago. the United States entered World War I this year, 100 years ago. And the Filipinos, we wanted to join World War I also. Why? Because we wanted to show that we were part of the world. We wanted to show we were responsible enough. We wanted to show that we could take on world affairs. And so some Filipinos joined up in the army. And Tomas Claudio was one Filipino who was sent to France, and he died there. He was the first Filipino to die in France in the battlefields. He was killed by a German shell. He died in 1918, so his death anniversary is next year. But after he died, and after the reports came in, the whole Philippines rejoiced. Actually, it's strange that they rejoiced, because it should have been a sad moment, because this is a Filipino who died in foreign soil. And yet, everybody rejoiced. We are making ourselves counted on the world stage. We are important now. And so when he was brought back here, when his body was brought back here, he was given a state funeral. Wala pa yung libingan ng mga bayani, so they took him to the North Cemetery where he is buried today. His hometown of Morong, Rizal, was extremely proud of the fact that it was a native of Morong who died in France. And he was the first Filipino to die in France in World War I, supposedly on the side of the right, on the side of the victors. That's a monument to him in Morong. Now, after he died, he became a second Jose Rizal. All towns and cities wanted to have statues of him, and they wanted to name streets after him also. At least one city still bears the name Tomas Claudio in one of its main streets, and this is Zamboanga City, aside from Morong, of course. But almost every other town wanted to claim fame by naming something after Tomas Claudio. Now, we have just about forgotten who this guy was. And the problem with this is, again, it's a way of historical memory. We remembered him because he was the first Filipino to die in World War I in France, but we forgot that after he died, there were some 50 more who died in World War I in the different battlegrounds in World War I in Europe. And we don't know their names, and we don't know. It's only now that we're finding out where some of them are buried. They were not buried here. They were buried in France or brought back to the States, and there's hardly anyone who's here, actually. But that's one of these things. Heroes made and unmade because they were forgotten through time. How many places do we still have named after him? Hardly anything nowadays. All right. Now we move into World War II. From World War II, there's a bevy of heroes. In fact, I'm not going to mention all of them because there are just too many of them. But just to give some of the more classic examples, because we are familiar with their names. We have Major Jesus Villamor, who was a fighter pilot and who fought the enemy or the Japanese over what is now Camp Aguinaldo. He was based there in a field in Camp Murphy at the time, took off in a very old aircraft and chased Japanese planes and was able to claim 2 of them. So he supposedly shot down 2 in a very outmoded aircraft. That was a feat of courage much higher and went beyond the call of duty. He didn't have to do that. I did get to meet later on another member of the squadron, of Villamor's squadron. He was junior to Villamor, but he flew his own plane. And just to show you the odds, and why these are heroic odds, is when he flew his plane, took it into the air, his plane had only 2 machine guns, and in the process of shooting at the Japanese, 1 machine gun jammed, and he tried to clear the jam by pulling the charging cable. It was an old US plane that had been handed down to us. It had been built about 10 years before, and so it was pretty rusty and was no longer very functional. When he pulled the charging cable, it broke in his hand. He had only 1 more machine gun left then, and he fired that, and when the gun jammed again, and he pulled the cable as hard as he could, probably too hard, and it also broke in his hand. And so imagine a fighter pilot without machine guns holding the charging handles of both of his guns and no longer able to do anything with them. He decided to try to chase a Japanese plane and ram it if necessary, thus committing suicide if he did. he claimed to be, if he had succeeded, he would have been the first kamikaze pilot of the war. But his plane was so old that it could not catch up with the Japanese planes, and he eventually landed it back in Camp Aguinaldo. He thought he was safe, and when he thought he had been spared, and when he climbed down his plane, he looked at his plane and saw that it was riddled with bullets. It had over 100 bullets, and he had just managed to land by a miracle, and he fainted after that. So that was the type of thing that we have. No, I mean, people going above and beyond the call of duty against all the odds and all of this. Another person who flew in that fight was Lieutenant Cesar Basa. He was unfortunately shot down, and he was killed. He was killed very dramatically. He bailed out. He was in his parachute, and Japanese planes shot him as he was floating down. Very interestingly to us, he landed very close by here. His body dead on the ground when he landed on the ground, and people living here took him to the Manila City Hall, which is where Philippine Army headquarters was, and they brought the body there. It was received, and it was taken care of there. So how is he commemorated? How are these two commemorated today? We have Villamor Air Base, and we have Basa Airfield today. There's also another one I'd like to point out, and this is Sergeant Jose Calugas. He was not a member of the Philippine Army. He was a member of the U.S. Army, the Philippine Scouts, but he was the first Filipino to be awarded the Medal of Honor in World War II. What was his claim to fame? He was not a combat man. He was a cook by profession. He was in the rear lines of his unit. He was in fact preparing lunch when the battle took place in Layak Junction. And he noticed that one of the artillery pieces of his unit was shot, that people had been wounded or killed, and he, from the kitchen, ran to the front, organized a group of soldiers, got the gun firing again, and managed to stop the Japanese for 3 or 4 hours, almost single-handedly. So that earned him the Medal of Honor. And the Americans recognized this very quickly. They recommended him right away. He was awarded the medal, not the medal wasn't there. He was given the commendation in Bataan itself. So if there was an action that was heroic enough, it would have been recognized right away, and the medal or the citation awarded right away. Villamor won his medal, the Distinguished Service Cross, even before they went to Bataan. He was already awarded this medal before the defenses moved to Bataan. So they were recognized very quickly. Now, the defenders of Bataan and Corregidor, we look at them generically because that is how they like to be called. They created an organization called the Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor 10 years after the war in 1951. And to show that to them rank made no difference, they called each other Defender. Defender Cruz, Defender Sarmiento, Defender Yabut, and so forth. So the ranks did not mean anything to them. This will tie up with something that I will bring out towards the end. And then the guerrilla resistance movement. Again, there are too many to mention here, so I will not go into them in detail. Let's just say that many of them were extremely young. Some of them were teenagers. Some of them served as couriers, even as children. And women were also very active in this. They were not given medals at the time, but they were recognized after the war. The Bolo men I specifically mentioned here because these were volunteers and they didn't even have weapons, they didn't have firearms at all. All they had were bolos, and that's why they were called Bolo men. Again, they were volunteers, so at the end of the war, the Americans said, you volunteered, no pay, you don't get pay. So none of them was pay recognized after the war. You were volunteers. Civilian heroes. We had more than our share of civilian heroes. They were in the arts, they were in literature, they came from all walks of life, they were politicians, and so on and so forth. Now, how do we memorialize them? Okay, the painting at the top shows Villamor fighting the Japanese. You can see just how different the aircraft are. His is this plane in the center, a very old plane fighting very modern Japanese aircraft. The right is Lieutenant Basa, a young man. He was in his early 20s when he was shot down. The bottom photograph on the left, this is Sergeant Calugas being awarded the Medal of Honor after the war when they had the medal physically here. He was a unique man because, again, he was a cook. He was not trained as a soldier. And he also had a, what was this, what do you call the, yeah, he had a hair lip. No? So he had a hair lip. He was not, as you see the picture, he was proud of that hair lip, actually. He didn't have it operated on. So the American and Philippine flags are flying there. And then the defenders of Bataan and Corregidor's insignia, again, because they all wanted to consider themselves at par with each other. They were the same, regardless of rank, regardless of unit. They were all defenders of Bataan and Corregidor, and they didn't want any particular distinction above that. These are the death march markers that marked each and every kilometer of the death march. Because after Bataan surrendered, as we know, the survivors of the defenders of Bataan and Corregidor were forced to march from Bataan all the way to San Fernando, where they had to take trains, and then they got down at Capas and marched to the concentration camp. In order to memorialize that in the 1960s, the 25th anniversary of the fall of Bataan, 1967, the government launched a project to commemorate every single kilometer by a kilometer post. And that is the one on the left side. It was mounted on a steel pole, and every kilometer from the kilometer 0 starting point, they had that along the way. And that ties up with our commemoration here of national artist Legazpi, because it's he who designed the mural on the sign that we have here. He was commissioned to show that, a soldier on the ground literally crawling and another one ready to fall. So this was in the late 1960s to commemorate the tragedy of the Death March. Since many of the poles eventually wound up missing, the first time I went to Bataan, I could still count them there, but as time went on, they began to disappear. Some of them because these were made of high-grade steel, and so some of them were stolen for the steel content and melted down into other stuff. And others were hit by vehicles passing by the road, and after they collapsed, they were never replaced. So in the last 10 years, a new memorial was put up, the concrete memorial that we see on the right, but it still contains the same illustration of the Death March that was there in the 1960s. How else do we remember these heroes of World War II? In money. Look at all of our bills and we'd see a Filipino in one of them. We have Quezon, we have other political giants. The 1,000 peso bill commemorates our World War II sacrifice. There are 3 in them, and each of them symbolizes something about each person there. We have 3 people there. Jose Abad Santos, it was the anniversary of his execution only 2 weeks ago. He was killed in Mindanao. Body was never found. And then we have Josefa Llanes Escoda, who was killed by the Japanese in Manila. Body never found also. And then we have General Vicente Lim, who was also captured by the Japanese and eventually killed in Manila. Body not found again. So all 3 of these are World War II Filipino martyrs to the cause. They also symbolize something else. Jose Abad Santos was acting president of the Commonwealth of the Philippines at the time he was captured. Quezon had evacuated to Australia and thence to the United States to keep the government alive. Abad Santos was his proxy in the Philippines when he was captured. The Japanese knew who he was and therefore tried to coerce him to join their puppet government. He refused and was executed as a result of that. So that is one sign of courage and going beyond the call of duty, refusing to cooperate with the enemy power. Josefa Llanes Escoda, important because she was a social worker. She was a civic action worker. She had campaigned for women's rights, and she had campaigned for the women's vote in the 1920s and the 1930s. She also was the founder of the Philippine Girl Scouts. So she was a very important woman in Philippine history. During World War II, what did she do? She tried to gather food and medicine for prisoners of war and the less fortunate. The Japanese found this out. They captured her towards the end of the war with her husband, separated them, and killed both of them separate from each other. General Lim, what was his claim to fame? Lim commanded a Philippine Army division in Bataan, one of two divisions that was commanded by a Filipino. All the others were commanded by Americans. Lim's division was one of the strongest there, delayed the timetable of the Japanese, and his division was known as the Rock of Bataan. It stood its ground as long as it could. But when the surrender came, he, together with his men, were forced to surrender. He marched the death march, he was imprisoned, and after that, the Japanese kept close watch on him because he was a ranking officer in the Philippine Army. He wound up linking up with the guerrillas. Where were the safe places to meet? He couldn't meet at his home because the Japanese were watching his home. He met elsewhere. The safe places he could meet in the church, Quiapo Church, because the Japanese didn't follow him inside the church, or in Philippine General Hospital, where he claimed to have sickness and he was in PGH. But eventually the Japanese did find out the guerrilla connections and captured him, brought him to Far Eastern University, tortured him, and executed him. Again, situation unknown. So for three of them, government, civic sector, the military, you have symbols of resistance fighters, heroes from all sides of the Philippines. The bottom photo is an interesting photograph because it's another sign of heroism that again departs from the traditional idea of resistance and warfare. This highlights the role of civilians in the Bataan Death March. When we listen to stories of the Death March, it's usually about the prisoners of war who are struggling to march under difficult situations, sick and hungry. Along the way, they were aided by civilians who risked their lives to provide them with food and water. As they reached the northern towns of Bataan and as they moved into Pampanga, the civilians risked everything to try to give them assistance. And so this memorial was put up to the civilians who tried to help the prisoners of war. Ironically, this memorial is not in the Philippines. This memorial is in the United States. It's in Florida, of all places, too. So we have not yet put up our own memorial to the heroic civilians who went out of their way to save these soldiers marching the Death March. Among the stories also told there, it's not shown here, but it's shown in a small sculpture that a friend of mine did. Some of the elderly women wearing long skirts actually came close to the marchers, asked them to come under their skirts, and then walked very quietly and slowly with somebody under their skirts. So a number of my friends actually were saved that way, but we didn't know who the saviors were. And there are no medals for this particular act of courage and heroism. So again, we are left with generic memorials like this to commemorate those unsung heroes. Now, if we move into beyond World War II, of course there are more heroes after World War II. The different conflicts we were involved in, the Korean conflict, other wars around the world, United Nations operations, we'd again have the classic definition of the heroes there. In the Korean War, one of the Filipino heroes who died and gave up his life there died because his men died in the front lines and he insisted on taking them back one by one. He was told not to do that because the enemy had already taken the front lines, but he said, my responsibility is to the families of my men. I must take their bodies back to home again. So on one of his last trips to the front, he had brought most of the bodies back, but on his last trip, he was shot at and killed and became one of the bodies that had to be recovered later on. So they were brought back here and given a hero's burial afterwards. Korean War, but then non-combat also, Red Cross, pacification campaigns, the 1986 People Power Revolution. Again, there was an attempt to get the names of those who had participated. I think in 1987, there was an attempt to get people to list down their names, those who had participated in the EDSA uprising. That was now very difficult to do. And then the government has been talking about the Bagong Bayani, or our OFWs now, who have left house and home to get a more stable job abroad. And then the Boy and Girl Scouts through the years. Again, unsung heroes. There are generic memorials to them, but again, specific actions. Only if you go to local towns will you find out that there were local Boy Scout and Girl Scout heroes. They have not, unfortunately, made it into mainstream national histories. The martial law victims, many of them unsung, and now a lot of them forgotten too. Okay, just a few days ago, I was able to come up with these photographs. They are original photographs and showed that what happened in the last years of martial law, the violence of those last years. This was a whole series of photographs showing the dispersal of a rally in Quezon City in 1985. And the people would be known to my generation, the younger generation would not particularly know them. The lower photograph, the guy being given the gas mask here, because tear gas was thrown at them, this is Lorenzo Tañada. He deserves a book all of his own because he was a guerrilla fighter during World War II. He had fought for justice right after the war, and he had campaigned against martial law during the worst days of the martial law regime. He had never been given credit, he never won a medal, and he never wanted a medal for that. The upper photograph shows another rally, and here we see two key people there. Again, you have Lorenzo Tañada, and then you have Chino Roses as well. So these were very important characters at that time. But unfortunately, again, there is no monument. The Chino Roses, there is a street named after him now in Makati. There's the bridge in Mendiola is named after him also. But other than that, again, to the younger generation, these are things that have to be further enshrined. So these photographs, in fact, nobody knew about them. They were just lying around in a second-hand bookstore. And as soon as I saw them, I knew what they were, and I got them all. There were more. So next time I go there, I'll look for these. But things like these are still things that still have to be placed in the national mainstream ideas. All right, then, okay, sorry for the small type. I was a little excited when I was doing this. So just some notes and observation on heroism and heroes. They are not necessarily limited to the Philippine experience, but also some of them go beyond. So one, heroism was not limited by race, gender, age, professional, or educational background. Anybody, and anybody in fact, did become heroes when the time called for. So whether you are rich or poor, elite or ordinary person, college graduate, PhD, or an uneducated person, it didn't matter. All people have that particular quality to become heroes, and they did become heroes. They involve selflessness and usually the risk of one's own life. If one looks at American Medal of Honor winners, the strange thing about them is not all of them are actually awarded to people who killed the enemy. Here, when we look at a Filipino war movie, an older Filipino war movie, what would we see there? We would see the actor, the chief, the star, mowing down Japanese soldiers as if they were bowling pins. That's not the case. And in the US case, the Medal of Honor winners were not those kind of people. They were those who sacrificed themselves for their own fellow men. Many of them, for example, jumped on grenades, dying in the process, but saving the rest of the men around them. And that happened in Philippine history as well. So selflessness, risking one's own life. Many of them were actually ordinary people doing extraordinary acts in extraordinary conditions. And I've tried to give you examples of some of them in the past. Not just in wars, but also in disasters and in difficult times. And some of them were leaders, many more were not leaders. They just simply reacted to the exigencies of the time. Courage, decisiveness, conquering fear for a higher cause, these were other commonalities. The higher causes, sometimes family, sometimes friends, sometimes comrades, sometimes the hometown, sometimes the country, on a larger scale, the country, humanity, or ideas, democracy, or freedom. These became some of the things that people would actually die for. And I threw in another point here, humility. Most of the veterans I met who had won medals during the war or after were extremely humble about their experiences. And even the children would find out that their parents who had won, let's say, the Distinguished Service Medal or something else, the parents never talked about the medals. I have been to several houses of veterans, and the veterans did not even know where they had placed their medals. They would tell me as an aside at the end of the interview, oh, I was also given this medal by the Philippine government or the US government, and I don't know where it is. And so sometimes after that person died, the family would find the medal and say, he never told us about this. And he never bragged about this. And so I have had many children of veterans coming back to me asking, you interviewed my father in the 1980s. Do you still have that interview? Because that's all we have left of him. He never told us his story. So my conclusion about the real heroes, and this also was true about other heroes I met in the United States and in Japan, was that they didn't talk about their heroic deeds. They only said it was ordinary. I was expected to do that. They didn't brag about it. So not like some people who did bring it out in the open. In fact, I had also met a number of loud people who claimed to have been heroes in their own right. And after talking with these loud and rather brash people, their colleagues would call me aside and tell me, he's just given you a lot of false information. Don't believe it, because the real people will not talk that way. So that's why I put in humility. It is something that I noticed true with all the people that I interviewed in the past. And the same thing again, when that call for writing down the names for those who participated in EDSA came, I was there every single day, but I did not write my name down. To me, it was something that I had to do. And to most of these people, it was something they had to do, and they didn't expect anything out of it. So looking at some people who wanted to get medals and recognition, it goes against this particular trend of thought. Okay, now as we end, there are, of course, many controversies and issues that we have relating to heroism and Filipino perceptions of this. Firstly, who determines our heroes? Is it the government that tells us that? Some of us in the 1970s would actually say, Jose Rizal was an American-made hero because he was against violence and so forth. He was more of an intellectual writer. But if we look at what happened immediately after his execution, he was executed in 1896. There was a mass held for him by his followers. In 1897, there was a commemorative ceremony held for him by the revolutionary forces underground. In fact, there was a requiem piece written for him about 2 years after his death. So he was already recognized as being an important person at that time. And when the act came, declaring him as national hero, he was already recognized by many Filipinos as one of the outstanding heroes of Philippine history. The problem, of course, here is, why should we stop at one? Should it always be that we should only have one national hero? So we have the controversy, should it be Bonifacio or Rizal? There are actually many heroes that we have, and perhaps we should not really stick to just one national hero. Two, can heroes be legislated? This is related to what I've just mentioned earlier. Some of them have, in fact, been legislated by the local towns and municipalities or cities. But again, is that factually correct? Some of them are buttressed by data and people's memories. There are places that are named after heroes. In Palawan, for example, in Puerto Princesa, there is a park called Mendoza Park. It was named after a prominent doctor in Puerto Princesa before the war, Higinio Mendoza. He joined the guerrillas and became its de facto leader throughout most of the war. Was captured by the Japanese and executed. And that was where he was buried. And today it's still called Mendoza Park. That is understandable. He was a local hero. He was recognized by all. But there were other places that are not actually, cannot be legislated. You cannot have it being enforced by a particular law. Popular acclaim, some people will talk about their own heroes, whether or not they are recognized by the government or not. There are folk heroes, and some of them were actually considered bandits by the government. Louis Taruk, for example, was considered an enemy of the state after World War II, and yet he was lionized by his followers. And eventually the government did recognize him as a freedom fighter too. And I knew him personally, and I saw the respect that his former Hook members gave to him. They looked at him with a great deal of respect. So popular acclaim, even without legislation, people will choose their own heroes. Controversial heroes, now not all our heroes are that clear-cut. One of the more controversial, we might say, is Artemio Ricarte. And so who was Artemio Ricarte in Philippine history? He was a revolutionary general. He fought against the Spaniards in 1896. He was a teacher. He was not a trained soldier. But during the Phil-American War, he also fought against the Americans. And when captured by the Americans, he refused to swear allegiance to the Americans. So he said, I would rather spend time outside the country than spend time in the Philippines under the American flag. So the Americans deported him. They exiled him to Guam, and Guam was not a pleasant place to live in at that time. He was there with other Filipinos who refused to accept American occupation, Mabini and some other revolutionaries. Mabini eventually decided to come back home. He was dying. He wanted the last whiff of fresh air in his homeland. And when he came back here, he signed the oath of allegiance to the United States as one of his last acts. He died shortly after that. Ricarte, on coming back, changed his mind and told the Americans, I am not signing that oath of allegiance. I am continuing to resist you. So they imprisoned him in Bilibid prison, 7 years they imprisoned him there for 7 years alone. He wrote his memoirs there. And after a while, they took him to Hong Kong. He escaped, went to Japan, and stayed there as an exile until World War II. When World War II broke out, the Japanese brought him back and tried to use him as a tool for their propaganda. He worked for a while, but then turned against the Japanese too, and so the Japanese eventually disavowed him, and they cast him off. But in the end, what happened to him, he was considered working with the Japanese. In the end, his fate was very tragic. He was brought to the mountain provinces with the Japanese. He died in the jungles there and was not found for a long time. His bones, or his supposed bones, were recovered in the 1970s. And he was Ilocano. He was brought back to Manila by a fellow Ilocano. And he was buried in the libingan ng mga bayani. So there are issues with him. There was another person, I didn't place his name here, but the person is from the Bicol area by the name of Pio Duran. Before the war, Pio Duran had been a very strong supporter of Japanese culture and Japanese ways of life. He named some of his children after Japanese heroes, in fact. And when the Japanese invaded and took over, he worked with the Japanese. And at the end of the war, he joined the Japanese military organization called the Makapili. He was part of that. After the war, strangely, he was cleared of charges. Charges were dropped eventually, and he ran for congressman of his town. And his town elected him as congressman. And he ran for 3 terms and won 3 terms. He was there until the 1950s. And upon his death, the town decided to change its name to Pio Duran. And so it still is called Pio Duran today and has a monument to him in the center of the plaza. So locally, he was a hero, but in the national level, there were questions about him. And of course, there are other questions about others as well. These are just a couple of those that we have issues with. Unsung heroes, there are many more who never were recognized. And the problem with this is when you are awarded a medal by the armed forces, you have to have eyewitness testimony to state that they saw you actually do a particular event, or you actually showed that you were brave. In many cases, those two eyewitnesses were lacking, and so it was difficult to get them. And if everybody died, then there was no way of getting a medal in that place. So the unsung heroes are even more, and these included fishermen and farmers. One case in point, in fact, was during World War II, again, a Japanese Navy plane carrying the second highest commander of the Japanese Navy crashed just off Cebu. It was, the plane was located by fishermen of Cebu, of Karkar. They located it, they rescued the survivors, and they took them to guerrilla headquarters. The highest, oh, this reminds me of that, was it the BBC event? Okay, the fishermen rescued the survivors, and the highest ranking naval officer they captured refused to say that he was an admiral. And when the fishermen returned to the plane wreck, they found a satchel of documents which looked very important. Nobody could read Japanese, but because of all the red stamps in it, they knew this was an important document. And so they radioed Australia, and they said, send it back here. We will see what we can do with it. It was eventually sent back to Australia. It was translated. These were the Japanese war plans for the Central Pacific in 1944. Who received the credit? The guerrilla commanders, MacArthur, the fishermen. Only now are the fishermen being commended for having recovered the actual documents at the risk of their life. So, okay, the unsung heroes, the non-Filipino memorials. There are a number of memorials to non-Filipinos. Some of them are valid. One example I might give is the tomb of Harrison, from Harrison Boulevard fellow. What's his full name? Francis Burton Harrison. Francis Burton Harrison was, of course, important because he was Governor General when the Jones Law was passed, and he pushed Filipinos to enter government during his term. He was loved by Filipinos at that time. He loved the Philippines, so much so that in the 1930s, he came back here and became a Philippine citizen. He died on Philippine soil, and he's buried in the North Cemetery today. I came across his grave a few years ago, unsung, unknown, former Governor General of the Philippines, now Filipino citizen, deceased, he's there. That's all right if we have things like that. There are others that are like that also. But what about the memorial that we have in Mabalacat, Pampanga, to the kamikaze pilots? There is a memorial of a Japanese pilot standing very alert, very strong, very military, ready to take his plane off and crash it into an American ship. Now, we are the only country in Southeast Asia that has a memorial to the Japanese kamikaze fighters. The veterans of World War II wanted to take that down. They complained, but the people in Pampanga said that will attract tourism, it will bring in revenues and so forth. And so that brings us to the question of, is that what our heroes fought for? For tourist revenue and income? And that again brings us to this question, question of heroes, how well do we remember them actually? Another case in point is when you go to Fort Santiago, we had many martyrs get killed there during the Spanish period and of course during the Japanese occupation. I knew several people who were incarcerated there. There was a marker there placed in the 1960s giving the names of several prominent Filipinos who were incarcerated in Fort Santiago during the Japanese regime. Many of them had died there. Now, in the 1970s and the 1980s, that marker was moved aside. And now I'm not sure if it still is there. The last time I was there, I couldn't find it because they said it might scare away the tourists of a certain nation. So, is that then how we look back at our heroes? And so we go to these non-Filipino memorials and myths and politics. Perhaps we don't have to mention this too deeply. There are enough myths and untruths and alternative facts going around these days that we can raise it afterwards, but I think we all know what we're talking about here. There's just so much, and since it is now 75 years since the war, you have a lot of these alternative facts coming out now. And also, another thing that has changed through the time, through the years, is that today's world is quite different from the world of 25, 50 years ago. The millennials, social media, this was not around in the 1950s, 1960s, the 1970s. So you can spread a lot of information very quickly, and also you can actually get a lot of real information nowadays if you have the patience to do so. But if you are very quick and just looking at Wikipedia, for example, sometimes Wikipedia can, of course, be manipulated to present alternative definitions. So today's media is a little different. Today's world is a little different. Some people have been asking actually, are heroes still relevant to this day? Is heroism still something worthy of study? When I was young, many people said we liked reading biographies because they gave us examples of moral courage and they gave us examples of lives that we could follow. Nowadays, we have so much information in our hands that how many people actually look at the Rizal Monument and wonder what this was all about. There is a rumor, or there's that story that that's why there are guards in front of the Rizal Monument, because they're guarding the 3 gold stars above it. And then there are other stories like that. No, so one wonders, yeah, what happened to our heroes after all? So to my, because I knew some of them personally, because I was closely attached to some of them, I believe that our heroes are still worthy of respect. It's just that we should know who they are. We should look more deeply into who they are, who they were, and really look at them, give them the respect that they deserve, and look forward to the future with them guiding us. So with that, let me close my talk for this afternoon. Thank you very much for your attention. And
Okay. Thank you. In a very feeble attempt to just jump off from what you've just told us, sir. I'd like to really thank you, Dr. Jose, for taking time out on your father's birthday to join us today. One thing that I think, because I'm looking at the crowd, and at least from the ones who I know, there's still a lot of, the crowd is primarily still made up of people who are working in the cultural sphere. And the reason I brought up the Stanford study was, one of the points raised there was the idea that facts are not the convincing measure of opinion, and rather emotions are actually very ignored in that equation. And the sphere of art and culture is primarily that sphere, which is still looked upon as possibly the most effective way of getting to the emotions of people. So that's one point I wanted to raise, and how you very efficiently also told us how questions of representation really figure in how history takes shape. You know? Yeah, before I go on to my own questions, perhaps this is a good time to open up the floor to questions that you may have. They can use, you have to use this mic? Oh, there's another mic at the back. Okay. Maybe while you're still getting your courage up to do that, one other point that was really that really stuck to my mind while listening to you was, given the criteria that you gave us at the beginning, I really was asking myself, are artists heroic? Because you kept emphasizing the idea that a hero, at least in your reckoning from the interviews and your experiences, they usually never want a medal. And what was that other point that you're saying? And yeah, there's a very strong sense of selflessness, particularly in the case of the National Artist Award, for instance. That's really like a basket of worms we could open today. The idea, for instance, that an artist can be declared a national artist is something you will find very controversial once you move out of Metro Manila. Once you go out to Mindanao, for instance, you will have artists talking about how many Mindanao-based artists have actually gotten into that roster. Yeah. So it really dispels the idea that history is something that is fixed for all time and is not contested. Yeah. Did I give you enough time? Yes, Alice. Oh, go on. Really? Um,
If I might
sige,
add.
sige. Sige, sir.
Well, yeah, again, many of the examples I gave belong to the classical definition of heroes who were fighters, warriors in the military, because those were the bulk of the people I interviewed and interacted with when I was younger. But I also interviewed a number of artists who were alive during the war, and they did tell me their stories. It's just that I couldn't find the proper visuals to illustrate their own examples. We had artists who were drawing, who were even Fernando Amorsolo, in fact. One thing Amorsolo did that was able to contribute to our understanding of that period was he was painting under Japanese orders. He painted a number of portraits. He painted Vargas's portrait, he painted Laurel, he painted the Japanese Prime Minister, and these were under Japanese orders. So he had no choice but to do that, being a recognized artist of that era. But on the other side, at home, he was sketching what he saw on the streets. He was sketching the difficulty of life at that time, the difficulty of life that could not be captured in words, but which an artist could capture on canvas. Not really canvas yet, because he was doing pencil sketches, but he showed the emotions of people, the hardships that they were experiencing. And this was something that we could not recapture after the war, because it took an artist's eye to be able to capture that particular incident at that time. I did interview a couple of composers as well, who composed during the Japanese occupation. Again, they had no choice. In order to feed their family, they had to earn money, and they did compose under the Japanese. For movies, they had a competition at the time, they did that. But underneath that, they were also composing for the guerrillas. And had they been caught by the Japanese, they would have been arrested and executed. So you actually have a surface life that showed them ostensibly working with the Japanese, but actually underneath, they were doing their own share as artists to keep the flame alive, and therefore were heroes in their own right. Unfortunately, we don't have the type of medal to award to these types of people. So the same thing, we can go all the way back to 1896, the musical compositions, the marches for the Katipunan, those also helped to inspire people to fight and to be patriotic. Only lately did we rediscover those marches from 1896, 1897, and they still are very stirring marches to this day. So the artists did have a role to play. They were heroes in their own way, but the framework that we reward heroism, aside from the National Artist Award, we don't quite have the same. The military is more organized, but for the civilian sector, we don't quite have the same number of medals to award for valor.
I'd like to bring up perhaps a point that we might take on from the last forum that we had just a few days ago, called Art and Martial Law, which had Dr. Maris Jokno alongside Dr. The Twin. One of the things that we were just beginning to speak about then was the idea that there's a very strong public perception of artists, at least some artists, having a very privileged space under martial law. In fact, that was that was a very strong undercurrent in this exhibition, which of course you are all invited to look at afterwards. Would you say that? I mean, right now we're still tangling with the problem of the myths continuing to perpetuate themselves over time from that period. Um, how culpable were artists in playing up that representation then?
Well, given the fact that they were artists, I think some of them had no choice at the time. Others probably saw it as a golden opportunity. In fact, one would say, okay, the creation of the CCP itself. This was, of course, before martial law. So it was a positive note at that particular time. I think also the period of martial law where they gave space on radio for Filipino music, the OPM, I think that was a positive step. But it does not take away, or it does not remove, the human rights abuses, the censorship that was imposed, and the other negative impacts that we had. So there were, well, if we go to the Japanese occupation, we also see that some of the composers, some of the artists did collaborate because they said this is a way of showing the Filipino nationalism within a different framework. So remove the Americans, let's use Filipino, let's use Tagalog, let's use our own idioms. In fact, after the war, you have this continuing on. So there were, it's again, when you evaluate a period, it's not exactly black and white. There are blacks, there are whites, but there are also grays. And you have to look into that variety of reactions and experiences.
Yes, Kiri.
I was just interested about, is there research done about artists, specifically visual artists? Because like what you mentioned, what the examples that we have are those who collaborated super on the surface level with the colonizers, and then supposedly also worked with the guerrilla movement. But I'm interested to find out if there's like research about visual artists who really did work, completely resisted the colonizers, perhaps joined the resistance movement, and did they continue their practice? Because like from my recollection, I didn't study history, but most of the time artists are commended when they completely give up their practice and completely stop drawing or painting and just take up arms. But like recently, I encountered the work of a Vietnamese artist named Dinh Q. Le, and his research was into visual artists in Vietnam during the war who joined the guerrilla, joined the resistance movement, and he did research and tried to collect their works while they were in the underground, and these were small sketches, which are not even paintings. But I was wondering if something like this is being done in the Philippines, because I've been invited to talks, for example, about visual artists during martial law or an earlier period, but I couldn't really find, not the ones that are published in newspapers or exhibited in galleries, for example.
Unfortunately, I don't know of any work that does that. I mean, that just looked at the guerrilla visual arts. There's been a fair amount of stuff on Japanese occupation visual arts, the paintings, because they did have collectors, they did have exhibits. But from the underground, the difficulty with the underground was that most of the publications they had were very temporary. They were not full scale. I mean, they were not mainstream type. They were mimeographed sheets. They were handwritten. So many of them have been lost through the years. I do have some that these are mimeographed sketches. They used to decorate underground newspapers in Negros, and then a guerrilla unit in Quezon in Mount Banahaw. Actually, one of the more famous political satirists in the Philippines Free Press, Esmeraldo Izon, he left New Manila entirely, went to Mount Banahaw, joined the guerrilla group, and did the cartoons for them. So unfortunately, he did not write about it. Oh no, he did write about it. It's never published as a book. So he wrote about his experiences first while here, then he giving up the whole Japanese occupation life and moving into the guerrilla territory.
I'd like to add to that, particularly in respect to to World War II. H.R. Ocampo, for instance, was ended up in Bilibid precisely because he had been identified with the Japanese administration. But there is evidence that that does prove that he was working both sides.
Yeah.
In the same case, for instance, as
Yeah.
Carmen Rosales, there were artists who were in a way trying to curry favor with the administration to create a space for people that so that they would move and to live. But of course, the public perception of that becomes very
Right.
controversial.
Right.
Um,
Even in music, in fact, I'd say you would have what is his name? Felipe Padilla de Leon. He had been commissioned by the Japanese to write two very often very almost replacements for the national anthem. He wrote two very catchy tunes there, and yet in an interview after the war, he mentioned that in those tunes he put in phrases from the Philippine national anthem and even from the U.S. national anthem as a kind of as a form of resistance. So they would play that every day, but people who could detect those particular bars would say that's the Philippine national anthem.
And in particular regard to martial law, because I'm coming out of a research on Purita Calo Ledesma's archives, and one of the things that I was able to unearth there was that she had, despite the public perception of Purita is she comes from a very privileged class, hacendero class, and she's a patron of the arts, but she apparently had given financial support to underground publications.
Connie Ledesma is her daughter.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So it's a very undertold fact na kasi nandun yung on the masthead of Lingkod Bayan, I think that was pinasalamatan siya.
Yes,
Uh-uh.
but we're talking about funding. I'm
Uh-uh.
looking
Not-
at
not
like
going- Not taking up arms, definitely.
Yeah, I think the thing about taking arms is not everybody can take up arms because physically, would you be able to live in the mountains? If you had a family, you were responsible for your family first and foremost. So there were others who wanted to, but especially for the older ones, the Katipuneros, some of the surviving Katipuneros still wanted to go, but they were in no physical condition to go up into the mountains. So you have restrictions. So it's in wars, it's usually the younger group, the younger generation that winds up fighting in the front because they're physically fit, they're idealistic. The more mature people will still probably do it, but in a different way, in ways that they are able to maximize what they have. So the artists, I think, would have done the same thing.
Thanks, Gary. Any more? My family's here, by the way. I'd really like to thank you for being here today. We've had a bit of discussion on this point.
I'd like to add something. Because we had the last dialogue with Maris, and she was talking about the discrepancy between what is being taught in education system
Yeah.
and what is being actually found in the
Yeah.
ground.
Yeah.
And then with regards to both of those observations based on your research,
Yeah.
you also cited that the history of a bit of in Cebu, even in Magellan, is a bit off. A bit. That's what I felt. But
Yeah.
even if I did my research there, I felt it was the same thing. It was off.
Yeah.
So maybe you can add a little insights on what can be done and now.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a problem in textbooks. No? Textbooks are supposed to, one thing about textbooks is they're supposed to present the basic facts of history to a generation that is not familiar with them. So in many cases, it's the first time they would encounter this. So when is the first time you encounter Rizal? You encounter Rizal in elementary school. But you encounter Rizal not as a national hero, but you encounter Rizal as a youth, as a boy. So remember the stories that we learned about him throwing away the slipper after he lost one slipper, and his different stories. So they're catered to people's generation, because you cannot talk to them about full-scale nationalism if they're in grade 5 or grade 4. They'll not be able to comprehend that yet. You have to build it up. So precisely, textbooks are not the best way to learn history, actually. Today, for example, when you go into high school, when you look into Philippine history, and even some colleges, the textbooks for colleges really show, okay, they go at the Spanish period in some detail, the American period, the Revolution, they do that. World War II, they only have a very few pages for this. And then in the post-war period, it's just a summation, President Rojas, President Quirino, President Magsaysay, and then very quickly, positive contributions, negative contributions. That's basically all they learn there. And since this is the end of the semester, you're tired of all of this already, and everybody just wants to get it over with. So by the time you get to martial law, you've really gotten an overload of all these details, and you cannot, everybody wants the semester to end by this time. That's why in places like Japan, it's actually Japanese history is taught in 2 semesters, because they cannot handle that long period in 1 year, 1 semester. It has to be in 1 whole year, or even more. So that's one problem, trying to squeeze so much into a very limited period of time, and then trying to portray, I think that Dep Ed wants to show not only the negative thing, but also the positive thing. So there's a positive side and there's a negative side. So that's always what they emphasize. So in the end, you don't get to see what the ultimate, what the real legacy of martial law was. Because you see there are good points and there are bad points. What was the bottom line of this pala? You don't know. You're left on your own. So that's one problem. And then again, locally also, its myths are very easy to accept. But like the Battle of Mactan, one of the myths I heard there was really, I mean, it had local color. Definitely, it's interesting to study in terms of local culture. But it said that one reason why Magellan was defeated was not because only of Lapu-Lapu's forces, but also the fish in the sea and the sea urchins all jumped up and out of the water. And remember that Magellan's legs were open. The breastplates were armored, but his legs were open. So that was the weak spot of the Spaniards, and even nature therefore attacked him. It's nice in terms of local color, yes, but how believable is it? So sometimes myths can be used as a teaching tool. And again, the media can serve as a way of making people understand. But hopefully, from that point, people will get to see the larger picture. But again, as you mentioned earlier, your first notions are usually the notions that stay on till the end. No matter what the facts are presented to you, you will always say, that's what really happened then. So how do you remove those preconceived notions? That's a very great difficulty for us. So I teach college students. So when they get to me, they have all of these notions already, among others that history is boring and that it's not something that we need. But after you handle the class and you show them that it's directly related to you, you show that even within the UP campus, these things happened. Bonifacio passed through here. These 2 buildings saw the Japanese occupation, and so on and so forth. And I ask them, talk to your family, see how you connect to this. Then that's how they can connect. So it's not something in the classroom alone. And again, textbooks, definitely not the textbooks alone. They have to move beyond the textbooks. But again, given social media, given internet now, you have so much more available to you that, in fact, one reason why we were very shocked, 2 years ago we had a public lecture series on martial law. And this was kind of pushed on because one college in UP wanted to rename the whole institution after the Prime Minister during martial law. And so
and they succeeded.
And they succeeded. We were the only institution that questioned that. And we said, why is your historical memory that short? And the guy is still alive. And if we look at our laws, actually, you're not supposed to name a building or a street or a plaza after a person who's still alive. You have to, the prerequisite is that that person is dead. So today, Quezon Avenue is okay because he's dead, or anything else. But someone who's still alive, that was illegal. So he said, it's the program that we're naming, not a building. So we held a 4-part lecture series on that. We brought in media, we brought in the arts, we brought in the political scientists, social science. We studied the whole thing, and we'll be publishing that hopefully this year. But the one thing we found out, and we were very shocked at, was many of the young students there began saying, we never heard this. We didn't understand it. We were taught differently in high school. So this is completely new to us. And one of the speakers showed to us very pro-martial law videos and presentations in the internet. And we said that is where we failed. We had not realized the power of the internet in reaching out into the masses or the younger generation. And for most of us who experienced martial law, of course, we were not internet savvy. And so then we said there has to be a counter to this. And it's only then that people began saying we do have to have a stronger internet presence. So it has to go beyond the classroom, it has to go beyond the textbooks. And again, myths do serve as a way of getting the message across, but ideally it should be tempered with fact. But again, ideally, because again, to me and to some of my students who are history majors, we do get to see that change happen, but to others, as you mentioned, it is the first impressions that continue to stay.
So there's a definite failure in representation that we are having to deal with as people who are working in education. I suppose what really comes out strongly from what you've been saying is that the battle is not over. Despite our, how we have been defeated along the way, we need to keep working.
Yeah. Again, as a kind of sidelight to that, after the 4-part lecture series on martial law that we had, we also presented last year a forum on the Marcos burial in the Libingan. It was supposed to be a balanced perspective. We wanted to bring in all different points. And we announced it to the general public in our Third World Studies website. It was jumped upon by trolls, and within minutes, the site was put down, flooded by trolls, that it collapsed. So it's then that we saw that the power of this modern age is something we have to learn and that we have to master if in fact we are to contribute to it.
Yes, please.
Good afternoon, sir. Along the way you speak about a question of heroes, it came both back to me about my colleague in the Adam Houston University about the idea of like the famous Jose Rizal in the world almost. He talked to me about that Rizal is not a liberalist. He talked about because he raised letters to Spanish in the Spain, to be equal. He write a statement to be equal with the Spain, the Philippines. Is it true about what do you think about it?
Yeah. Okay. Again, when we look at Rizal, we have to look at him also in the context of the time. So if we look at it from today, medyo iba na yung perspective ngayon. If you're looking at it at the time, 1880s, 1890s, it was very difficult to speak your mind in Manila. If you spoke against the Spaniards, you could be arrested at the time. So even, remember, the Kalayaan newspaper was an underground newspaper. Nung nakita, hinabol ka agad, sinira ka agad. No? So it was very dangerous to speak your mind. Kaya when they went to Europe, they found out it was very different there. They could speak freely. And that was what was totally lacking here in the Philippines. So the first step, I think, when we look at the period 1880s, 1890s, this is still a period of nation building. We were trying to, kasi the problem with the Spanish occupation is that yung divide and rule policy. So we did not get to identify as Filipinos until a little later on, because the provinces were really very divided. You were Ilocano, you were Batangueño, you were Cebuano, and there was very little semblance of unity except in a more general sense. But people could not travel from one province to the other. So there was no national language. Tagalog was not the national language then yet. So what were the stages in nation building? To Rizal, who had seen what it was like in Spain, sabi niya, the best way to do this is to ask for equal treatment from the Spaniards. Kaya yung mga batas nila sa Spain, dapat ipaano nila dito sa atin. That was the first step. And then, in fact, independence was not yet in their minds yet, because we could probably do it within the framework of the Spanish system. So, how would you win respect with the Spaniards? Dapat i-prove mo sa kanila, we are your equals. Because remember, the Spaniards had that built-in discriminatory look. Indios kayo. Iba kayo. No, you're lower than us. There's no way you can. Kaya you needed us because we civilized you. But if Rizal and his group of Filipinos in Spain could show, we are your equals. We can speak Spanish the same way. We can paint the same way you are painting. We can argue the same way you are arguing. That was one step. You would win their respect. And once you win their respect, we can push further. So it was a staggered approach, actually. So Bonifacio, of course, was looking at it from a different point of view. Kailangan mass movement kagad. But even he was also working with that framework. We have to build the nation first. Kailangan we have to have a bottom line for everybody here. So yung problema dun was there were different ways of looking at that. How do we build the nation? Do we build it so that the West will respect us and treat us as equals? Or will we build it totally separate and hiwalay na tayo sa kanila? So even that, kaya nagkaroon ng all these differences during the Reform movement, during the Revolution, even the American period. Kaya all these different possible directions were being argued upon at that time, because we were still in the process of forming ourselves.
Okay. Yes, Iris.
Hi, sir. You earlier mentioned local heroes who aren't in the mainstream consciousness.
Yes.
Are there any efforts
Mhm.
within the educational system of the regions,
Yeah.
or even outside,
Mhm.
to actually make people and students know more about them?
Yeah. I think on the local level, I think DepEd is now starting to focus also on local. Kaya in the new curriculum, I think it's grade 5, they're looking at history on a local level, hindi national. What happened in your town? What happened in your province? And then from there, you build to the national level. So that way, you get the local heroes ingrained into the national identity. The other things about it, I think National Historical Commission has been trying to bring local heroes more into the mainstream narrative. But if you'll notice in my presentation, I did not mention anyone from Mindanao specifically. I didn't bring in any Muslim heroes. We did have, and we still have. The movement from that, of course, is there is a move in the Congress to add a 9th ray to the Philippine sun. But there are efforts now being taken on the local level to elevate these local heroes into a more national level. But yun nga, mahirap because some of them, again, there are still the unknown heroes in the local levels. Some of them are very well defined, some of them are not.
I just wanted to add a little bit to that, sir. Kasi I was part of a training maybe 2 months ago for those who were going to teach contemporary art from the regions. And one exercise was getting the teachers to think about who are their local cultural exemplars. And I just want to say that the role of research in being able to do that is extremely important, because what happened in one exercise was that the first things that came to mind were their local celebrities, the ones who make it to the talent shows. So Maski yun, kailangan i-work out yung idea of what is excellence, what is it that should be modeled. It takes more work to do archiving kasi, so...
Yeah. Actually, nga, several years ago, the Philippine Veterans Bank, together with me, we have a traveling exhibit, the Traveling World War II exhibit. It started in Dagupan, and then it moved to Baguio, and Zamboanga, and Davao. And as it moved from place to place, sabi namin, so that the local people will be able to identify with it, kailangan hindi lang Luzon o hindi Manila lahat. So every time it moved to another place, nagdagdag kami ng isang panel on that particular place. So Iloilo, what do we have on Iloilo? It came to Davao, we added something on Davao. So as the exhibit moved from place to place, it got bigger and bigger actually. And it became more representative of the Philippines because it had places that had not been mentioned before. And they would ask me to go on a lecture tour. Every time it moved somewhere, they would ask me to lecture there. And I made sure that my lecture always brought in the local heroes. So whether it's Tagbilaran or Davao or Cagayan de Oro or Baguio or Lawag, I always brought in the local color. So they identified and they said, hindi namin alam yun. It was not taught to us pala. So now we know what we have. So yun, it takes a lot of work and it's a work in progress.
This is a question for both of you, since you're both educators. And I mean, given the way that, since you've brought up representation several times, and given the way that the frameworks and the channels for representation have multiplied so much, we communicate very differently. It's kind of obvious in the government appointments we're seeing right now. So how do you see, and yeah, so we're already listening to things like memes, we're looking at all these different channels for information. And data it's become like air, basically. How do you see these posing? I mean, what kinds of challenges do you see in terms of what they're posing to the way you teach about history and about art and how it affects, the discussion around heroes?
Okay, my case, I was very reluctant to change to the modern technology. I was one who resisted it for a long time. I did not have a cell phone until 6 years ago, and my cell phone up to last week was still a 6-year-old cell phone. It was my first and only cell phone, which therefore is breaking down already. So I got a new one last weekend, and I'm seeing now the potentials for this. I also was a slow convert to Facebook. Everybody was into Facebook already, and I said, no, I'm not into that. I joined it, I think, late last year, and immediately had all these friend requests, and I have forgotten how many friends I now have. But my posts are quite different from other posts because I put in where I would go and give the history of that, and I would get queries and I would get likes and all of this. No? In some cases, 50% of my friends, or in some cases even more than 50%. So they were interested, they were following what I was doing. So they said, your posts are different, send more, because we want them. It's the kind of stuff that we want. So I would explain what happened in Cagayan de Oro, what happened in Davao, and all these other places, and they said, we never knew about this. Sometimes my friends would be from there and said, I'm from there, but I didn't know about that. You taught us more. So as an educator, it goes beyond the classroom, and so even into social media. Some friends are saying I should have a blog, but I don't have time for that anymore. But right now, I know I'm reaching a much larger audience than I was a year ago.
Oh, I have a very short answer to that. I would say, as an educator, you can't afford to be a snob in regard to the media sphere. You just need to, the learning curve is very steep. You need to learn to be savvy about the technology as well as be critical about it. But you have to learn how people are using the language and how you can make a difference by using the same the same grammar sometimes. I mean, you have to write more briefly, more wittily. There's things like you have to pick up along the way that they never teach you in grad school, by the way. But it's something you need to do. I think you had a question.
This is more an observation. I think with creating heroes, well, really depends on the matter of perspective and who's the one in control, usually, no? The powers to be. So, um, like for example, the case of a president that we have, whom when I was studying back in the 80s and the 90s, I vividly remember he's always depicted as a collaborator, and that was the word that they used, Jose Laurel, during the Second World War. So, of course, some people see it differently, so I guess it's just really a matter of, our creation of heroes depends really on a lot of these powers to be. Now, I guess they say in a war, it's the conquerors who really create the narratives and the history. But in peace, it's the one who's in power. No, so there.
Well, that's true. In the case of Laurel, actually, when I did encounter him in the textbooks, and the textbooks today still say that he was a puppet president. But since I have studied in Japan and since I knew people who were actually involved in that, my conclusion now is very different from what the textbooks say. He was not a collaborator, he was not a puppet, he had his own line of thinking, and people did see that even after the war when he became senator, you would still see that nationalist line there. So the textbooks are giving him very unfair treatment. I've been talking to a lot of people and asking why has DepEd not changed their textbooks, because the evidence is all out there, not from the Philippine side but even from the Japanese side, and it's very, very clear that he was his own man, and yet the textbooks are still 30 years behind the times. Yeah.
Can I just say it's no joke to write for a textbook? I mean, we tried it just recently.
This one.
Yes, Tita, please, go ahead.
Mhm. Okay, yeah, so so the question really is regarding the movie General Luna, and how is Aguinaldo, I mean, from a more, from a more detached point of view, I guess. Uh, it's difficult to say, because the literature that has come out has been very, very emotional on both sides. I would like to give him the credit for doing what he could within that span of time, within his limitations. The one thing that I think we tend to forget is that heroes are always human. They're not perfect. They were just like us. And when we look at Aguinaldo, he became president when he was in his 20s. So he was about 24, 25. I think he was very young at that time. And imagine being thrust into that position of responsibility at that young age, not knowing exactly how complicated Philippine society was. And that's why Mabini was very important to him, because Mabini provided the intellectual background. But the problem with that was you were dealing with the ilustrados, you're dealing with the power brokers, and how could you resist that kind of group if they were giving you their support? So in some cases, I think Aguinaldo was tragic because he didn't fully understand what he was getting into. He was not in a position of total control. He was a dictator at one point, but even within that position, resources were limited, people he could trust were limited, and perhaps the idea also was that he was still Caviteño, and I think perhaps he was thinking in Caviteños, again, trying to transcend the Caviteño in moving into Filipino. How do you do that in a short period of time? So the people he trusted were from Cavite, essentially. But the same thing is true with the AFP today. If you're an Ilocano officer, you're going to battle with Ilocanos because you understand them, despite the fact that it is a national army. Imagine what it was like in 1896, 1897, when we didn't have those structures yet. So I think it's much more complex than we actually say. So sometimes I find myself understanding him, sometimes I find myself cursing him. But then I realized he was in his 20s, he gave him a chance like that. But again, the other point I had not raised in my talk, I forgot to include it, there was you are a hero at a particular time. Okay, so given you're president in 1898, you stayed on in 1899, you're not always a hero. It depends. Your life is not limited to that particular time. So sometimes people will remember, okay, you were very good at that time. But some people get lost along the way. And in Aguinaldo's case, well, he might be forgiven for his failings in 1898, 1899, but what happened afterwards, and it makes you suspect things. So he, for example, he disliked Harrison very strongly. He loved Governor General Wood, who was the enemy of Quezon and others. And then during the Japanese occupation, while Bataan and Corregidor were still fighting, he broadcast to Bataan saying, surrender now, the Japanese are our friends. And he does some other things that are rather questionable during the Japanese occupation. Then after that, there are other things he does. And probably the unfortunate thing for him, or fortunate depending again which way you look at it, he died in 1964. So that's a long life. And he never spoke out categorically on some of the questions he was asked several times. What about Luna? What about Boniface? He never answered those questions as long as he lived. And so we are left in a quandary. What was this guy really like? And so, yeah. So, yeah, again, in terms of heroes, there was one incident I was going to mention. Napoleon awarded one of his generals a very high medal, and the next move he did was he ordered him shot because he disobeyed orders.
Good afternoon. Magandang hapon po. I chanced upon a book written by Soledad Borromeo
Yes,
Brewer,
yes. Yeah.
scripted by men, not by fate. And it is a damning book. And it really, I don't know, it's one of those emotional
Yeah.
other side
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
But it's well researched. And it says there that Aguinaldo was a power grabber. And they scripted, including the murder of Bonifacio.
Yeah.
And before he died, Aguinaldo, he wrote a memoir
Yeah.
where he tried
Yes.
to
Yes.
clean up
Yes.
the records.
Yes.
What can you say about that?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's also one perspective. But I think if you were young and if you were in that situation, I think you had to be a power grabber to put yourself up there. But again, there would be limits. That's why I think it should have been a transition period. So perhaps you could have power initially, but you'd share it later on. I think Quezon had the same view in 1936-37 when he was president of the Commonwealth. He felt the Philippines needed a strong president. And so in fact, some people were criticizing him. He was a dictator. And, but others, his supporters would say no. Now, the thing about Aguinaldo, of course, yes, he did write that, or he supposedly wrote his memoirs. He wrote 3, actually. He wrote one in the 1920s in Spanish. He wrote one later on. And then in the, I think just before he died in the late 50s, he wrote another one. But this was ghost-written. I knew the ghostwriter, but I never asked him about this, actually. So the problem with a ghost-written book is how much of it is the subject and how much of it is the writers. So sometimes it's very difficult to tell. So in this particular case, yes, I think what was this? It was, I think his published biography was Another Look at America. And it was, he did try to downplay these events, Bonifacio, Luna, and all that. He was still alive when it was published, but again, it was ghost-written by a professional journalist of that time, a very well-known journalist. And so, how much was it the journalist speaking, how much of it was Aguinaldo? You can't tell. So, he remains a quandary to this day. So again, you can hate him, you can love him. One other difficulty with him, of course, is that there are strong supporters of him even today. His relatives, his descendants are still in power today. And so sometimes it gets you into trouble if you try to do something about it. There was an American writer here in the 1960s who did his doctoral dissertation on collaboration. And he interviewed most of the people. They were still alive at that time. He submitted his doctoral dissertation. The dissertation was published as a book, and he left the Philippines almost immediately after. He said, I'm not going to be subject to libel cases. So we have a rather antiquated libel law, actually. It's very antiquated. It still considers libel as a criminal offense.
Well, perhaps we could end on that difficult note and remember that history is continuing to be written and that we can participate in how it gets shaped, if only by asking our questions. So thank you for being here today. Thank you, Dr. Jose. I'd just like to announce that if any of you are interested to do a brief walkthrough through the exhibition, you're quite welcome to join us. And you can have an announcement.
I also want to invite everyone. We're going to have the closing performance of another exhibit that we have now. Just across the hall is the exhibit Another World, and the artist Russ Ligtas will be doing a closing performance at 5 p.m. So we can have the walkthrough, then we can make a day of it and go to the closing performance. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. Thanks.